Cillian Murphy's 28 years later return was perfectly set up by this story 15 years ago. A 15-year-old story perfectly set up Cillian Murphy's return as Jim in 28 years later. Although most details surrounding 28 years later's plot remain shrouded, it is hard not to be excited about the film's release because of 28 Days Later's enduring appeal. The fact that 28 years later's cast also includes talented actors like Jodie Comer, Aaron Taylor-Johnson, Ralph Fiennes, and Jack O'Connell further raises the hype surrounding its release. However, what already makes 28 years later one of the most highly anticipated movies of 2025 is that it marks Cillian Murphy's return as Jim. The Academy Award-winning actor was previously only confirmed as the film's producer, sparking speculation surrounding his return as his 28 Days Later character. The speculations turned into reality when his return was finally confirmed. While it is unclear how 28 years later will continue his 28 Days Later narrative, a 15-year-old story can serve as the perfect opening arc for Jim's narrative in the sequel. 28 years later can continue Jim's story from the 28 Days Later sequel comic. The comic book extends Jim's narrative from 28 Days Later. In 28 Days Later's theatrical ending, Jim, Selena, and Hannah receive an optimistic conclusion where the three characters escape Major West and his men, and even get rescued after putting out a huge cloth banner for Finnish fighter jets. Since the three characters do not appear in the sequel, 28 weeks later, it is hard not to assume that they lived their worst days in 28 Days Later and found themselves in a better place after the movie's events. However, Jim's comic book story suggests otherwise. As the original 28 Days Later comic sequel suggests, Jim was arrested for killing Major West and his soldiers. He was also put on death row, scheduled to be shot dead by a firing squad. Since the comic book suggests Jim likely died after being executed, 28 years later cannot adopt all the details of his narrative. However, it can portray how Jim remained imprisoned for 28 years after the first movie's events. This would be the perfect starting point for 28 years later, not only because it would effectively portray how much Jim has suffered since the first film, but also because it would parallel Jim's opening arc from 28 Days Later. Jim's stories beginning in 28 years later can be similar to his opening arc from 28 Days Later. The comic book arc could add immense depth to Jim's characterization. Just like Jim's 28 Days Later story begins with him waking from a coma and being unaware of what happened to the world, his 28 years later arc could show how he has recently come out of prison and is naive about how much the world has changed since the outbreak's inception. If 28 years later adopts this narrative, it would perfectly honor the first film's story by drawing parallels to its opening, and, at the same time, give Jim's narrative a fresh start. When Tom Rothman confirmed Cillian Murphy's presence in 28 years later, he quoted that the actor returns in a surprising way, and in a way that grows. For obvious reasons, Rothman did not give away any major details surrounding the character's story development in the new movie. However, if 28 years later attempts to continue Jim's comic book story, his introduction as an ex-inmate in the movie's opening arc would be surprising and leave enough room for his character's growth. Hopefully, 28 years later will consider using Jim's comic book narrative as his backstory and explore how his experiences in prison have further calloused him and altered his perception of the zombie-infested world.